Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to, oh, it's Wednesday. It's St. Patrick's Day, by the way. St. Patrick is a saint, obviously. It's a big day in Ireland, and so Irish people celebrate St. Patrick's Day. Sometimes they have things like green beer, which is strange, and I don't know. It's weird. You're supposed to wear green today. If you don't wear green, people get to pinch you. Yeah, well, does that count? I guess that counts, right? Okay, so nobody can pinch any of us. Uh, yeah, so that's what today is. Today is St. Patrick's Day. Let's just say hello here. So Ryan is here. So good morning, Ryan. Abby's here. Good morning, Abby. Simrat is here. Good morning to you, Simrat. And I think that's Sophie. Is that Sophie? I'm not sure. If it is, good morning. Good morning to whoever you are. So, jumping back into where we were yesterday, we were talking about Indigenous people in Canada. We told the whole story, but now oh, it's Blake. Sorry, Blake. Good morning, Blake. We were telling the whole story, and then we said we don't want to kind of leave these people in the past because Indigenous people still exist in Canada, and they have they have lives, right? They have things that they are working towards, and so it was important for us to kind of not only know the history and know the story, but also to hear from people who currently exist, right? And so we watched this documentary hosted by Wab Canoe here, and I asked you some questions, right? And so the first thing I said is that there's a bunch of stereotypes that surround Indigenous people in Canada. And so what were those? What were some of those stereotypes? Help me out here. Say what? Yes, yes.
I feel lazy.
Yeah, laziness, uneducated.
Drug addicts and alcohol.
Yeah, problems with substance abuse, drugs, or alcohol, right? Yeah, the idea that they don't work, they don't pay taxes, they just want a free ride from Canada. And of course, none of those things are really, well, some of them have a grain of truth, right? But we saw that there's lots of different Indigenous experiences across Canada. And so, yeah, many Indigenous communities are struggling with drug and alcohol addiction, with suicide. Some of them are struggling with domestic issues. Some of them are struggling with infrastructure issues because the reservation's so far away from town, and because they're underfunded, their housing and their water supply is kind of questionable. And so there's lots of struggles, right? But there's also, good morning. There's also success stories as well. And we met a number of people who are moving forward and helping others to move forward as well, right? We met people who are lawyers, who are artists, who are professors, who are teachers. We met people who are running daycares for kind of Indigenous and non-Indigenous kids to kind of mix together. We met a woman who's running a support group or a support institution for vulnerable women. We met all kinds of different people, right, who are kind of moving forward and kind of attempting to create a new identity, right? We said that, what was kind of the most, for you, like watching that documentary yesterday, what was kind of the most interesting part? The part that sort of, oh, that was kind of cool, or oh, that challenged what I thought I knew, or I thought it was this way and it's that way, or what kind of stood out to you in that documentary?
Some people sleep waves about those stereotypes about indigenous people.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, some people.
It's not true.
Yeah, some people still hang on to those old stereotypes about indigenous people. That's true. What else? What's kind of stood out to you? So nothing stood out at all. It was just like,
I have prior knowledge to this subject.
that's okay. But what was kind of most interesting, or
The act color,
the what?
the act color drawings.
Oh, okay. Like the artist that we saw, or Kent Monkman, or the sort of comic booky guy?
The drawing Ken.
Ken Kiwatin Sanderson, I think his name was.
The one who
Oh.
drew the drawings.
Right. Kent Monkman.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very. Sorry.
He had the courage of disrespecting the government. The
Mhm.
way.
Yeah, his artwork does kind of take a lot of courage, right? And he's sort of standing up for indigenous people. He's kind of speaking out against the government. He's come out as a gay man, right? So he's kind of in a minoritized group there as well. That couldn't have been an easy thing for him to do. And of course, he's an indigenous person, which is not the easiest experience you could have in Canada. And so, yeah, he's got. He's been very brave in terms of, or he's had to be very brave in terms of putting his artwork out there, right? But it's also been very successful, fortunately for him, right? What else kind of stood out to you?
The elders thing, that they like to help the other,
Yeah.
that was kind of interesting. In more people don't usually respect elders that much.
It's true, right? Especially, particularly in the West here. The West is a youth-oriented culture, right? We respect youth and beauty far more than we respect age and wisdom, right? But yeah, indigenous cultures are the opposite, right? The respect goes to those who are older and wiser, and yeah, that's who you would go to. Is you would go to elders, and they would help you with your problem or with your struggle, right? What else? Anything else?
Yeah, some people still are like do stuff with problems of indigenous people.
Yeah, there's people who have very recent experience, right? And a lot of a lot of the people we met in the video, they went to residential school, or their parents did, or their grandparents did. And so yeah, this is not this the I guess the trouble that indigenous people have experienced here in Canada is it goes back a long time, like it goes back hundreds of years, but it doesn't end hundreds of years ago, right? It's very fresh, it's very recent, right? And again, things are kind of turning around, I think, but it seems that we always take a couple steps forward, and then we take one or two steps back, and we don't really gain any momentum.
Sorry. All those people who went to educated on residential school,
Mhm.
they're all uneducated or
No, not necessarily. I mean, everyone's experience in residential school is going to be a little different. I mean, there's a difference between going to a residential school in 1889 versus 1940, right? There's a difference there. It matters. It matters which residential school they go to. It matters how long they stayed there. It matters, who they are as a person. Like there's kind of as many different experiences as there are people, and so some people got out and managed to, some people were horribly traumatized. Some people managed to make it out with not being too traumatized, and it's a mix, right? On the whole, you could say that the schools were very substandard, and horrible things happened in them. But that doesn't mean that every single person experienced every horrible thing that could happen. Many did, and again, the bar for this is 0, right? Like no kids should die at a school. No kids should be abused at a school. And so, these schools are awful by any measure you want to use, but not everybody had the same experience. And some people managed to get out. Some people didn't go, some people didn't go to residential school, right? So many Indigenous kids did, but not everyone did. And so it's a real mixed experience. Yeah, you couldn't say that everyone had the same one. Anything else we should talk about, or we should ask questions about in that documentary? Okay. Let's see here. Yeah, so the relationship between Indigenous Canada and non-Indigenous Canada, again, it's still a difficult one, right? There's a long history of marginalization and abuse and cultural or actual genocide, right? And again, that's difficult to heal, right? That's difficult to kind of get over, particularly when Indigenous people are still suffering a lot of the same problems that they always have been, right? And again, those stats that I showed you, Indigenous people are more likely to not finish high school, more likely to be in prison, less likely to have a job or to make, equal amounts of money as non-Indigenous people. They're much more likely to live in substandard housing and to have to boil their water because they can't get clean water from the tap. I mean, all of these things kind of add up, and so it creates a pretty marked inequality between Indigenous people. And so again, you can say, oh, well, that stuff was all a long time ago, which is partly true, but again, the effects of it are still lingering, right? And so we've had some steps forward. Like I mentioned, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a huge step forward in kind of allowing survivors of residential school to tell their stories, but also allowing Canadians to hear it, right? And part of that was necessary because a lot of Canadians hadn't really heard of them at the time, and so it was useful for to get that stuff out in the open for people to know about it. Again, we've had a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women, and again, it's useful doing a study, it's useful looking into this, but it's also useful just to make the public aware that we actually have a problem here, right? Indigenous women are far more likely to suffer violence, to disappear, to wind up murdered than any other demographic. And so it's important at the very least, it's important for Canada to understand that, right? We still have an Indian Act, right? So again, that's a complicated one because again, the Indian Act was originally a tool of assimilation, right? It was meant to make Indigenous people just like regular Canadians. But it's also the thing that outlines the relationship Indigenous people have to the Canadian government. So it might be easy to say, well, let's just get rid of this thing, right? This thing is a tool of assimilation. It's a a set of laws that apply only to indigenous people. Let's just get rid of this thing, right? Let's repeal it, right? But again, it structures that relationship. So a lot of indigenous people say they don't like the Indian Act, but they also don't want to get rid of it either, because without that, there's no relationship anymore, right? There's no, they are just like everyone else, right? And that's not entirely what they want, as far as I'm aware, because there was a thing, 1969, I think, is when it was, and it involved Justin Trudeau's dad, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Pierre Trudeau was the prime minister at the time, and he had this idea of a just society, quote unquote. And one part of that idea of the just society was that if you're going to have a just society, if you're going to have equality, you can't have some people with special rights, right? You can't have people with different rights and privileges, and some people can do this and some people can't do that, and you can't have that. Can't have that in society. Good morning. So Pierre Trudeau and a couple other government ministers wrote a paper that they called the White Paper. And a white paper is just, it's not a paper written by white people. It's kind of like an idea for a policy. So it's kind of like, if the government wants to make a change, it's like, well, what if we did this, right? What if we changed this? What would that look like? How would we go about it? What would be the effect, right? So it's not what the government is going to do, it's just the government kind of exploring an idea about what if we did this? And so there's lots of white papers out there, but this particular white paper had to do with basically abolishing Indian status in Canada. So no more Indian Act, no more government ministry that deals with First Nations people, no more status or non-status Indians. We get rid of that because Pierre Trudeau said, really the only way to have an equal society is to give everybody equal footing, equal rights. That didn't go over very well in the Indigenous community, and the reason it didn't is because, again, Indigenous people don't really want to be like everyone else, right? They were the first people here, right? This is their land that we are sitting on, and they still want a seat at the table, right? They still want to have a nation-to-nation relationship with the rest of Canada. They don't just want to blend in and just be like any other Joe Canadian. That's not really what they're looking for. And so Pierre Trudeau, they wrote this white paper and it got out. And again, Indigenous communities were like, no, that's totally backwards. That's not what we want. We don't want to be like everyone else. We want, we want some sort of seat at the table, right? We want some sort of ability to shape what goes on in Canada, because again, this is our place, this is our land, right? So again, even though the Indian Act is not perfect and it's problematic in a number of ways, it's also the only thing that sort of gives them whatever status they have in Canada, and so they don't want to get rid of it outright. Maybe modify it, but not get rid of it. Daniel, like you said, negative stereotypes and discrimination about First Nations people continue, right? Those ideas are not gone, they're part of culture. The government worked hard to spread those ideas, right? And again, some of those ideas have, grains of truth to them. If you go to the downtown east side, and I don't recommend that you do, but if you do, you will see a lot of desperate people, and a proportion of them are going to be Indigenous people, right? And so, again, sometimes people allow stereotypes, are sort of kept alive by the fact that, there is evidence of that truth, right? There are Indigenous people struggling with drug and alcohol addiction, with homelessness. We saw Herb Dixon in the documentary. He's struggling with that, right? And a number of people still are. Yeah, Daniel.
So that's true, but as you said, that there don't pay tax?
Oh yeah. They have a different. Their taxation is a little bit different if you are a status Indian. So if the government has allowed you to be an Indian, then your taxation is a little bit different. You can apply for different credits. I think your income is taxed either at a different rate or it's not taxed at all if you make your living on the reservation. Okay, so if you work and make your living on the reservation, but the problem is that almost no Indigenous people do that because most reservations have really no businesses on them. They're just a bunch of people living there, and people go off the reservation to go to work. So if you leave the reservation for work, then you just pay income tax like everyone else. So they do have some taxation benefits, but it's not that great. I'm not envious. I'm not envious of their taxation benefits. Good morning. So yeah, they pay tax just like the rest of us. They have some taxable benefits that I don't have. They're not that great, really. So again, I'm not envious. Yeah, and we still see, mistreatment by police. We still see evidence of systemic racism, and so yeah, this is a story that's not over, right? And again, sometimes we get a step forward. We get commissions or inquiries launched. Those inquiries have recommendations attached to them, but often nothing really gets done. And again, Justin Trudeau had a lot of promises when he was elected Prime Minister 5 or 6 years ago, whenever it was, and he hasn't really done too much to sort of fulfill those promises. And so it's a difficult issue. It's a real difficult issue, and it's made more difficult by the fact that, again, we can't put all Indigenous people into one basket, right? Every group is a little bit different. Every group has different priorities and experiences and things they want. And sometimes even within a group. There's a group here, and I believe it's a Musqueam group, and there's an oil pipeline that's going to, I think it's the Trans Mountain pipeline, which is going to go through their land. And so there's some confusion because within the community, the question is are the Indigenous people going to let this pipeline go through their land, right? And so there are hereditary chiefs, so traditional chiefs that come from chief families, if you will. They don't want the pipeline to go through. But there's also elected chiefs, and this is kind of a younger group. Again, they've been elected by the community, and the elected chiefs want the pipeline to go through because the pipeline means jobs for the community and economic development and money and all those things. And so there was kind of a battle, not between Canada and Indigenous people, but within the Indigenous community themselves about who was going to win the day, right? Were we going to respect the hereditary chief's authority or the elected chief's authority? And in the end, interestingly, the courts upheld the hereditary chief's position that the pipeline cannot go through. But again, it's complicated, right? Because not only can you not say all Indigenous people are the same, but even within one group, you can have people with very different priorities and ideas about what they want their community to be and to do. And then you have the courts who have to step into this and figure out, who's going to win, right? And again, has it done those people any favors now that they don't have the jobs and economic development that they were counting on? And really, was it the court's decision, or was it the court's ability to say, should the community have not sorted that out themselves and said, look, the court stayed out of it and said, look, you figure out what you want and then tell us later, instead of the court wading in and choosing a side? But yeah, it's complicated, right? Not all Indigenous people are the same. Not every group is the same. And even within groups, you have different priorities, right? About what people want for their community, for their land. It's a mess, right? It's a big tangled mess. Yeah, so it's complicated. I feel like at the very least we're talking about these things a lot more than we used to. There's a lot of Indigenous content that has been added into school curriculums in the past few years, and so it's something that people will continue to talk about. And really, the more people are aware and the more people talk about it, the more potential something will happen, right? That we will move forward on this relationship and kind of make some progress. But it's real slow. It's real slow progress. Any questions before we leave our Indigenous friends behind here? Okay. We're going to do something here, and I'm just going to remind you of a couple things, which I'm sure you know, but I'm just going to remind you anyway. Oppression. Remember, oppression is a set of policies or practices or traditions or norms or definitions or explanations that all kind of work together to advantage one group and disadvantage another social group, right? So dominant group is usually the one with power, and the one that is advantaged. Minoritized group is the one who is disadvantaged, right? And again, oppression is a societal level thing. It's not, it's not relational racism like we talked about. It's not comments or memes or anything like that. It's large-scale patterns in society that, again, serve to advantage one group and disadvantage another one, right? The other thing we've already talked about is this internal dominance and internalized oppression, right? So all of us absorb social messaging in society, and then we kind of act on those things. And so dominant groups sometimes will express their dominance in various ways, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, and minoritized groups will sometimes act out their oppression, right? They will act out the stereotypes, and we heard about that in the documentary, that Indigenous people have a lot of internalized oppression, right? When you hear messages about your people and how, stupid and lazy and uneducated they are, people absorb those, and sometimes they act them out, right? So, that said, right. We talked about that. I have an article for you to read, and it just occurs to me that I didn't put it in Microsoft Teams, but I'm going to put it in Teams in just a second here. So, where is it? Race and gender. There it is. Okay, I'm going to ask you to read an article, and I want you to do this for a particular reason. Sorry, I'm just distracted here because I'm going to just make sure that article is in Microsoft Teams where it should be. There it is. Okay, so I want you to read this article. It looks a little bit intimidating, and the reason it is because it's the real deal academic article, right? A lot of the articles that I pull for courses like this are from newspapers, or they're kind of a little easier to read. This one's the real deal. This one is an academic article. It looks to me, it's written by Shavella Pittman. It looks to me like it's her master's thesis. That's kind of how it feels to me, but I don't really know for sure. So she wrote a master's and then she turned it into an article, and I think that's what this is, but I don't know for sure. Now, one of the things, who here is going to university? Nobody? Anybody going to university here? Yeah? Do you plan to go to university?
Oh, yeah.
Simple question. Okay. Yeah, okay. If you go, or when you go, I should say, you're going to have to read academic articles, okay? And academic articles are a pain in the butt because they're long, They're often, written in academic language, and sometimes you have to read quite a few of them pretty quickly. And so what I want to do is get a little bit of practice in this in a more kind of basic way, okay? And so what I want to show you here is this. Basically, no matter what you go into, so if you go into science or social science or math or genetics or whatever, law, whatever kind of academic you go into, whatever you kind of major in, most academic papers are kind of structured mostly the same way, okay? Some of the headings are called things a little bit different, but basically every article has the same skeleton to it. It all has the same bones. And so if you know that, that's a bit of an advantage, right? Because before you even start, you know how that article is going to fit together. You know the building blocks, okay? So here we go. All articles have an abstract at the beginning. An abstract is just a brief summary, okay? So just, this is what this paper is about, blah, 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 right? It's a very short little thing at the beginning, usually in small print in a little box. All articles have a little introduction, right? So again, they generally introduce you to the topic, whatever it is. Most articles will have a theoretical framework or an approach or something that guides the analysis. And so this is kind of a section where the author says, this is the kind of theory we're working with, this is the assumptions we have, we're coming from this perspective, these are the things we think to be true, right? So this is their kind of theoretical approach, the way they're looking at this problem. Sometimes you'll have a bit of a Sometimes you'll have a bit of a literature review or a background. And so here is kind of where the author says, look, I know I'm talking about this thing, and here's all the other things I've read about it, right? So they're kind of proving to the academic community that they've done their background reading. They know who else has worked on this problem. They know what those people have said. And so, yeah, you have kind of a literature review. Sometimes you have a methodology. So if you have any kind of, if it's any sort of situation where you might have to run an experiment or do a survey or send out resumes with different names on them or pour an acid into a base or whatever you do in chemistry, I don't know. Whatever it is, there's always a methodology, right? Here's how we did the thing that we're trying to do, right? Here's how we sent out these resumes. Here's how we created them. Here's how we titrated the sodium hydroxide, I don't know. Here's how we did all this stuff, right? Then they'll usually give you the data, right? This is the data we collected. This is how many people called us back for an interview. This is, the amount of heat that was given off when our, solution exploded or whatever, I don't know. It's been a while since I've taken chemistry. So you get the raw data, right? Whatever happened. Then you get the analysis. So the author will say, this is what we calculated, we used some statistical tests, or we got percentages, we made a graph, we measured the temperature, we weighed the solution at the end. Whatever they're doing, they kind of analyze it. And then finally, there's a results or a discussion or a conclusion section where they kind of tell you, okay, this is what this all means, right? This is why, we started out with a question. This is the answer to our question. Yes, our hypothesis was confirmed. No, our hypothesis was not confirmed. We're not really sure what happened here, but we're going to continue to do research in this direction, or the things that everyone else thought about this issue were wrong. We've shown that it's something different. Something like that, okay? So pretty much every paper you read is built like this, and some of them have, some of them don't have all these parts, some of them have them called different things. And if you stay in academics long enough and you write a master's thesis or a dissertation, you'll find that this is basically how you write a dissertation or a thesis as well, because it has the same it has the same parts, it has the same pieces. They're just full chapters rather than sections of a paper. So what you're seeing here is kind of a very standard outline or structure for academic articles, theses, and dissertations, right? And so again, if you know that, it's helpful, because if the prof gives you a 30 or 40 page paper to read, you might find that you don't have quite enough time to sift through the whole thing. Or you might be worried about, oh gosh, like, what's important here, right? What do I have to pay attention to? So I'm going to help you out with this, because we're going to read this article that I've provided to you here, but we're not going to read the whole thing, because again, you can kind of get away with not reading all of academic articles usually. Okay, so this is what I'll suggest to you. Some of these things we're not going to read. Okay, so always read the abstract, right? It's the short version of what the paper is about, especially if you're doing research for a paper that you're writing. You just want to know what the whole paper is about in a nutshell, right? And so read the abstract, and then you're like, okay, does this work for me or not? You can tell in 15 seconds, right? Just by reading that little paragraph. Usually if the paper has an argument, which it always does, usually that's, summarized in the abstract, so you can figure out what the argument is. Very useful. Don't skip the abstract. The introduction, you can probably skip for time. Sometimes it's useful, but usually it'll just talk generally about the topic. Again, if you're squeezed for time, I would skip it. Theoretical framework. Sometimes you can skip this as well, especially if you're a first-year student, because you probably don't know any theoretical frameworks as a first-year student, right? You're just kind of, if it's a sociology class, you're just learning what sociology is like. You don't know a lot of theoretical frameworks. So sometimes you can skip over that, because really it's kind of it's for more advanced students. And so here we'll skip over it as well. Lit review, boring. They're super boring to read. They're extra boring to write. And so if you ever write a master's thesis or a dissertation, that will probably be your least favorite chapter, because it's very boring just talking about what everyone else has said about a topic. But it's still there, and it still has to be in your dissertation. You can usually skip it. Although, if you find an article that's really good, and you want more on that subject, look at their literature review, or actually probably just look at their works cited at the end, look at their sources. But that will give you some clue about what other people have written on the same topic, right? So if you're looking for more on that topic, have a look there. If you're pressed for time, skip it, don't read it. Methodology, sometimes you can read it, it depends, but in a lot of cases, as a first-year student, you won't really have the ability to critique it anyway. Like you won't be able to look at the methodology and say, aha, they used the wrong statistical test. They should have used the Q value of whatever, right? You probably won't know that yet. And so it's really more for the academics. It's not really for students. I would skip it. Here's what you do want to read though. You do want to read what their results were. You do want to read the analysis in terms of how they analyze the data, and you definitely want to read the results in the discussion, because that's the answer to the question, right? So again, if you're pressed for time, you can skip some of these earlier sections and still kind of get the idea of the paper, because in most cases, what the prof is asking you to understand is not every detail of the paper. They're asking you what the argument is, right? What is this paper arguing? What is this paper trying to convince the scientific community of? And you can do that by kind of skipping through and reading the parts that are most important, unless the prof, sort of tells you, this is what I want you to pay attention to. But if they don't, you can kind of get away with just reading pieces of it, and you will know what you need to know. And again, that's nice, because in university you're going to have way more work to do. You're going to have these big long papers, and you have to prioritize, right? You have to figure out how to read them quickly, right? And so if I were you, I would read them like this, kind of just the beginning and the end, and skip the stuff in the middle, unless you absolutely need to know it, okay? So we can practice with this with Shavella Pittman's paper here on race and gender oppression in the classroom. And so, yeah, as you can see, how many pages? So yeah, it's 14 pages, but we're not going to read all 14, right? Because we're going to skip chunks of it. So it's going to be less. Also, if you look at the end, Shavella's got lots of, where is it now? Yeah, she's got her works cited section, which is 4 pages in itself. And so, you know, we're going to take a 14-page paper and we're going to trim it down to probably 4 or 5, right? And that's much more manageable, especially if you're a busy university student and, you know, you've got a lot on your plate, right? You got to prioritize. You can't read and memorize every word of everything that comes in front of you, or you're going to crumble and explode, right? So you've got to find a way to streamline your operation, and this is kind of one way. So that said, I would like you to read this article, but like I mentioned, I only want you to read the parts that I've indicated here. So you can look at the introduction if you want to. I'd skip the theoretical framework, skip the lit review, skip the methodology, and go right to the good stuff. If you want to just scan those parts in the middle just to kind of see what's there, that might be helpful. Just kind of let your eyes run over it to see what kind of things Shavella is talking about. But other than that, you know, get right to the good stuff. All right, so I will give you some time to read this. I'm going to put 15 minutes on the clock here, and then we'll see where we are at the end of 15, okay? Again, it shouldn't take us too long because we're not going to read the entire thing. We're just going to read part of it, okay? Okay, hardworking people, let's take a little bit of a break, come back, finish the article, and then we'll talk about, I have some questions to ask you about what the argument is and kind of what we see in the article itself, okay? But let's take a break first. Okay. Whoops, let's get rid of this. Okay, people, so about how far are you done reading this article, or how far through are you?
Getting lost.
You're completely lost? How far along are you, though? Sure, I guess I'm just talking to myself up here. Can you tell me how far you are? Like, it's hard to ask questions and everybody ignores you, right? Like, it's a simple question. How far are you in this article? Halfway? Done? 75%? Okay, so maybe half? Okay, it's coming. Don't worry, it's coming. 75? No? Halfway? Halfway? Okay. Let's give you. I'll put 10 more minutes on the clock, and we'll see where we are after 10 minutes. Okay. I realize it's it's a little bit of a tricky article because it is an academic one, but I think it's written kind of as clearly as one of these could be. So it's not the hardest one you could ever read, but let's give it some more time and see how it goes. All right, let's see what we can do. So again, Shavella Pittman has an argument to make here because all academic articles are like that. They're all trying to convince either you or the academic community that the author is correct, right? That the studying they've done or the experiment they've done means this, or this is the result. And so Shavella Pittman here is no different. She's arguing something. And what does she want us to believe? What's the conclusion of her article?
You know, people of color faculty aren't white male students
Mhm.
aren't choosing the female people of color in the faculty properly.
I think I liked it the first way you were
Yeah.
doing it, but I know you kind of lost the thread. But yeah, that's exactly correct, right? The Shavella Pittman is saying that female professors of color, women professors of color experience discrimination and racism, gendered racism actually is the term she uses, in the classroom, mostly coming from white male students, right? That's the conclusion of her argument, right? She has a few kind of premises, and I think there are probably 3 or 4 of them. They're kind of similar, but what would you say that they are? Because again, as good critical thinkers, we should ask ourselves, Shavella, why should we believe what you say? How do we know that these women professors of color are experiencing gendered racism in the classroom? What would be one premise here? One premise here.
Meaning the reason to believe what they say.
Yes. Why should we believe that statement from Shavella? Has she given us any evidence?
Multiple teachers said so.
Yeah, that was how she collected her data, right? She interviewed a bunch of women faculty, right, at her university, and so they explained their experiences to her. It's probably worth noting here, if you did notice in the, I think it was in the research question, I forget where it was, but she says that she didn't specifically ask about white male students, right, because of course that would have biased her results. So what she asked about was, what's your experience in the classroom, right? So it was a very open-ended question, and so it was interesting that the white male student pattern kept coming up, right? If she just asked professors, hey, what's your experience with white male students, it might have been different, right? She might have got a different result, or maybe a biased result. So here, she just asked an open-ended question, and it was interesting that this pattern came up, right? Multiple professors mentioned this. Okay, so her evidence is interviews, right? She interviewed a bunch of professors, and what kind of things did they say? What kind of patterns of behavior did they notice with these white male students?
They felt like they were questioning their authority.
Okay, so they felt that white male students often, or were more likely to question the authority of these professors. In what ways did they question their authority, seemingly? How did they? I guess that's where that was. I'm just trying to remember. I know they mentioned that. I'm just trying to remember if that's where it was mentioned, or if it was mentioned in another heading. I think that might have been under teaching competency. Is that correct? Okay. It's definitely a piece of the puzzle here, but I think it just falls under a different category. Yeah? Okay. So, yeah, so these students challenge their authority, right? What's one of the things that they did?
This student emailed the teacher and said that they have teaching experience too, and we know that it's
I think that's the teaching competency part too. Yeah. But we'll be there soon enough. But let's see the challenging authority. Entering the office without knocking, right? So interesting that white male students seem to think it's okay for them just to waltz into this person's office without knocking, right? It's polite to give a little knock, right? But these professors note that white male students tend not to do that. What else do they tend to do or not do? Yeah, addressing the professor by their first name. And I think they pointed out it's interesting because there's an email from a student, and the email specifically mentions another professor, Dr. So-and-so, but then he calls the professor by her first name. He calls her Kate, right? And so, again, this kind of depends, right? Because some professors prefer to be called by their first name. Some professors prefer you to call them Dr. whoever. Kind of depends. But it's interesting how in the same email, they'll refer to another professor as Dr. someone and then just Kate for this professor, right? What else do we see? This one's kind of interesting here. Maybe I'll just read it. Authority issue. This is what Kathy, one of the professors here. Authority issues, although I think that I'm gaining more skills to deal with that. But I think what's the hardest for me is not knowing what my options are as a professional here, because I feel like a day will come when whatever skills I have, I'm in a situation where if I want to help, just what am I supposed to do? I think she's kind of talking about the idea there that, how, if she's the boss in the classroom, if the teacher is the boss or the professor is the boss, how kind of bossy do they need to be? And I know bossy is a bit of a gendered term, but how kind of, how relaxed can they be, right? And I think what Kathy's noticing, and I think what's probably true, is that male professors can get away with being less authoritative, right? They don't have to be as tough. They don't have to be as, they don't have to necessarily be strict and act like authority figures. But because I think women, for Kathy's, in Kathy's case, because women are less often seen as authority figures, they have to kind of work harder at the authority thing, right? The male professors can be a little more relaxed and chilled because they kind of have that authority already. Women have to work harder to establish it, right? And so I think that Kathy mentions it, and and Emily mentions it a little bit later. As a woman of color, I have to be very careful about how I behave in the classroom because of issues of authority. I can't be too friendly. I can be sensitive as a human being, but I can't open up totally, right? So for her, there's a different dynamic in terms of authority, right? She has to think about, she can't be too friendly or she won't be taken seriously as an authority figure in the classroom, right? And there's probably a racial element to that, but there's also a gender element to that as well, right? The second one, I think Mulder and Nasra, you both mentioned questioning teaching competency, right? So we had one student who wrote a long email to this prof about, oh, by the way, you made a mistake and you didn't correct it properly, right? And, feedback is one thing, but, that seems like the tone of the email was that, I know better than you because I taught some 6th graders once. And it's not the same, right? She's she's a professor, she's a PhD, she's an expert in her field. Sounds like it's history here, but I'm not sure. And, she slipped up. She said the wrong Roosevelt. There's 2 Roosevelt American presidents in the past, shockingly. But yeah, said the wrong one, right? Whoops, no big deal, correct it and move on. But he decided he was going to give her a lecture and then drop her class over it. Seems a little overly dramatic, but whatever. But again, you see this this is an internalized dominance thing, right? I know better than you. And, again, you have to ask yourself, would he have sent this email to a male professor or to a white male professor? And the tricky part about some of these things is that you never really know. And I think we see that come up a little later in the article, where part of the burden is not just how the interactions go, but the constant questioning of, is this because I'm a woman? Or is this because I'm a woman of color? Or does this person just behave like this with everyone, right? They always kind of question themselves. Whereas being in the dominant group, you tend not to, right? This is another piece of privilege. When people act like a jerk towards me, I never assume it's because I'm a white man, right? I'd never have to assume that. I just assume that either I'm being the jerk or they are, or maybe we're both being jerks. But I never assume that it's because of my race or my gender. But for these women here, it's always kind of in the back of their mind, right? And for some of them, they've said in a couple places, they say, but I don't know if that's what's happening, right? I don't know that I can say for sure that this is about race or about gender, but it feels like it is, and they're never entirely sure because, again, most of these students don't particularly say, I forget who mentioned it, but nobody says I'm bashing you because you're Asian, right? Nobody says that. And so you're never quite sure, these women are never quite sure what the dynamic of the situation is. And that's difficult as well, right? Because you never know, they're probably questioning like, am I crazy? Is this what's happening here? Is it not? Are they just a jerk? Am I being a jerk? And it's hard to sort out, right? Especially in the moment. Okay, that's all the time we have for this. We'll come back to this tomorrow. We're about halfway through, and I think we're going to get what we need to get from this, so that's good. So pack it up, and I will see you tomorrow. We'll finish this off, okay? And then we'll talk about white supremacy, I think. Okay.
Isn't that article something partially racist?
This article that we're reading?
Yes.
Yeah, a bit of both. Yeah. Is what? No, we're going to finish racism. I've got a little bit on religious oppression, and I've got a little bit on classism. Yes, and status and power. Yes. Okay, see you tomorrow, people.